Well, we're on lesson 56, and we're going to be talking about silk. Well, more specifically, we're going to be talking about the Silk Road. But first, we need to talk about the silkworm, don't you think? Well, when did silk develop? Who thought about making silk? Well, it goes back thousands of years ago. Actually, 2000 BC, when Wang Di's wife was out having tea, and these little worms fell into her tea, and she noticed these long filaments that were there and thought, wow, wonder if we could make silk out of this. That would be kind of strange, but that's how the legend goes, and that's how the Chinese have passed down how they found out about silk. And then they kept it secret for thousands of years until like the year 200 BC. Remember, it was 2000 BC before they decided to sell silk. And only the very wealthy could afford silk. And of course, the women would want as their silk scarves. Now, this is not really silk, but you can imagine they can make it very beautiful. And the silk clothing felt really smooth on their skin. So the very wealthy desired to have silk. And later on, they would decide to sell their silk at high prices, of course. Well, let's talk about this silkworm. Now, I'm not too much into worms and insects. When I think about it, I thought, well, this is pretty gross. But, the filaments became very, very smooth and special in making this silk. So, what kind of worm was this? Well, actually, it wasn't a worm at all. It was called the Bombyx mori caterpillar. It was a caterpillar. Bombyx, Bombyx. I had never heard of that before. Well, this caterpillar would turn into a moth. Well, let's talk about turning into a moth. A moth would be about 2 inches. That's a pretty big moth in diameter. And the thing about the moth is that it never ate anything when it was a moth, and it only lived for 2 days. But in those 2 days, they would lay hundreds of eggs. They would have to have a temperature being really nice, or they would die right away. The temperature would have to be like 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So they couldn't live any place cold or any place too hot or deserty. In fact, they had to live where mulberry trees grew. Mulberry trees, they have those little mulberries on them. You could pick them and eat them, but they didn't eat the berries. They ate the leaves. Well, not the moths, but the caterpillars. So the eggs would hatch in about 1 week, and they'd be these tiny little larvae that were just about, you could put 10 of them in an inch. So those are pretty tiny little worms. And they weren't worms, they were larvae, of course. And today, we'd put those larvae on trays in a climate-controlled greenhouse. That's how they make silk today. And they'd feed them every 2 to 3 hours, mulberry leaves. And after 4 weeks, they're fully grown, and they'd be 30 times their original size, about 3 inches long. They would secrete these filaments, and the filaments, can you believe, be 1/1000th of an inch. You could hardly see these filaments, but they would be 3,000 feet long. That's a long filament. Think of you're only about 4 feet, 5 feet tall, or even less, maybe 3 feet tall. Well, 3,000 feet would be 1,000 of you, wouldn't it? That'd be a very long filament. They would secrete this sericin, which is kind of a gummy-like slime from their mouth. And that would hold this slime, or this gummy stuff would hold the cocoon together. And in the cocoon, they'd make the filaments, and those filaments would turn into this chrysalis, stuff inside the cocoon. And then the mature moth would come out of the cocoon in about 2 weeks. But how would they make the silk? Well, what they would do, the silk makers, they would actually have to kill the silkworm when it was in the cocoon. And they would do that, and then they would take the cocoon and they'd soften it. and then they unwind the filaments into reels and twist the filaments together, twist all of them together to make thread. And then they twist the threads together to make yarn. And then they dye the yarn, and then they weave it into silk. So that's how they made silk. So, wow. So now we have silk. How spectacular is that? And how in the world did they think of all that? How did they know they could take that stuff out of the cocoon? Well, they must have figured it out somehow. But anyway, let's talk about China trading silk. For many centuries, like I said, they guarded it, and this was their secret recipe. And only nobility wore silk, so the regular people never wore it anyway. Until the Han Dynasty, I said about 206 BC to 220 BC, they started deciding to sell it to customers in the West because they could sell it for a lot of things or trade it for a lot of things. The traders came and traded wool, gold, silver, and they came to get the silk and the spices, jade, which is, jewelry, they made jewelry of, and tea. But they really were fascinated with the silk. And of course, those Roman emperors and their wives, they wanted silk. So the Silk Road occurred. They had to get there some way to China. And so the road to China was an overland road. It was called the Silk Road. Now they also took by sea. They went by sea and crossed the Indian Ocean, but that was a long journey, and that was a treacherous journey too. Well, the Silk Road was too. Both ways would be. I don't know which would be more dangerous, taking the sea or the overland route. But let's talk about the Silk Road. Well, after the Han Dynasty, there were like 6 other dynasties, and the China was pretty unstable during this time. But the Chinese merchants, even during this time, continued to trade silk. So you went through on the Silk Road. There might be bandits, you might get there, and then the dynasty would say, well, we're not going to give you silk, because they were very unstable. But they still wanted to trade and get the silk any way they could. Let's talk about this voyage. The starting point. Now look at your map. The starting point you look at the city of Xi'an, or Xi'an. It's Xian, but that's how you pronounce it, with that kind of a Z-ish look. And that's in China. And right there, they'd have to get there to get the silk. Okay, if they were to get the silk there, they would take this road that kind of followed the Great Wall of China, at least on the northwest side. We studied about the Great Wall of China, remember. And then it would go around China's Taklamakan Desert. Taklamakan Desert? Can you say that? Taklamakan? It'd go on the Taklamakan Desert. That was, the desert was very dry and very hot. And it could be very cold, too, at night. And then they would climb up to these high mountains, the Pamar Mountains in Asia. And then it would cross Afghanistan, which that country there was a lot of bandits and stuff through that country, that's for sure. And then part of the road would follow the old royal road of Persia down towards Iran, and it would kind of split off. And it would end in the Syrian cities of Tyre, Damascus, Antioch in the Middle East. So there's where they'd gather, and all the merchants would gather in those places and gather up the silk. And then they would ship it by boat, cross the Mediterranean Sea area to Alexandria. Remember, that's in Africa, that big city in Africa. Constantinople, we studied about Constantinople. Yeah, there towards the area that's now Turkey, and Rome and Greece and Italy. They all wanted some silk. That was the route of the Silk Road. Well, few people traveled the entire road. In fact, they wanted to have middlemen there to transfer the goods. So they'd go so far, and then they'd give it to another person, and go so far and give it, because it was such a long journey. So they would have these middlemen. The more middlemen they had, and these traders paid more money. So if you had 2 middlemen, 10 middlemen, more middlemen you had, because everyone had to make a profit and everybody had to be paid. So if you could have one person that would go all the way, it'd probably be cheaper than having 10, huh? But anyway, They would go on pack animals, and then they'd also have to go on riverboats and cross some rivers. The Silk Road was difficult, but it was very fascinating. The land varied from 500 feet below sea level to 24,000 feet above sea level. Those are some really tall mountains. 24,000 feet, that is a tall, tall mountain. We're talking about, yeah, almost having to wear oxygen up there, That's how tall, but they didn't have oxygen, of course. That's a big journey up, and you can imagine climbing that mountain. Ooh. They also crossed rivers, lakes, salt flats, deserts, through forests and other mountain passes, across the steppe. And the steppe was a plateau, high plateau area. And along the way, they'd have to stop at traders' outpost houses, forts, certain forts, caravans. Caravans would stop at the Sire. Those were the inns. They seated and they would get together and have conversation if they could talk the same language, and they would trade in these different areas, in these inn areas. They also went past several palaces, so you can imagine. But this kind of brought the cultures together. So they had to learn how to communicate, and they had to learn about each other's culture in the midst of traveling these long distances. Traders could become very wealthy, but it was kind of worth it because they had to be gone for months, and there were many dangers and uncertainties on the way. And most likely, when they came back, they would be changed, and maybe even they wouldn't be able to come back. Many of them died on the Silk Road. Well, the cities on the Silk Road would turn into cities. When they would start with being little villages, and suddenly they would be these huge cities. New cities would spring up, and little towns would grow huge. Some of the cities listed on your book there one is Samarkand, Uzbekistan. Another is Kabul, Afghanistan. Another is Kathmandu, Nepal. And then, of course, there's Taxila, Pakistan. That was probably the biggest and the most famous. It was a crossroad for 3 different trade routes. And the Persians actually found it in the year 500 BC, but they would trade there. And now with the Silk Route, they would use this route 3 different ways as they intersected, and everybody would come there to trade. So it became a big, big city. In fact, Alexander the Great came through that city back in 323 BC, and it also became a big site of learning and education, probably because of the Greek culture coming into Pakistan. That's unique. And also there was a new religion called Buddhism, and it started in 400 BC, and it kind of centered around this area now and around the Silk Road, and the Buddhism spread by the Silk Road into China. We'll talk about Buddhism later. The Silk Road, the Turpan Basin, was they have to go through this basin, and it was 508 feet below sea level. Can you imagine that? Hottest place in China and on Earth sometimes. Such a hot place. Also, the Flaming Mountains rose over 1,600 feet just above this low basin. So you'd have this high point and this low point. Water was very, very precious. In fact, they needed water to feed the people and the animals that were traveling, so they had to dig wells and make canals and reservoirs throughout and connect these wells with channel water. In the Turpan Basin, they have what's called the Gao Chang. It's a busy spot to stop there, and has an ancient water system there. Well, it was really cool because the cultures were mingled together, and the traders didn't trade goods. They also traded ideas, and they had new discoveries, scientific discoveries, and they traded artwork and architecture, and they learned languages, and later on the gospel, even the gospel would spread on the Silk Road. How exciting to learn about this road and how everyone wanted silk.